Your phone lights up. It's someone you care about. You send a message. They usually respond pretty quickly. An hour passes. Nothing. Then two. And suddenly, your mind is really busy. Maybe they're upset. Maybe I said something wrong. Maybe they're pulling away. Maybe they're losing interest. Maybe I should send another text. I should do that. Maybe I should explain what I mean. Maybe they didn't understand. Maybe I should just leave it alone. Do you notice what just happened? Nothing actually changed. The only thing that changed was uncertainty. And yet, your body reacted as though something had already happened. Most people don't realize how often this occurs, not just with text messages, with relationships, with work, friendships, family, decisions, conflict, with life. A feeling appears, and almost immediately a story arrives. Not because we're irrational or because we're broken, because uncertainty is uncomfortable. And human beings are incredibly creative when it comes to escaping discomfort. And today, I want to talk about that space, the space between the feeling and the story, the space between what happens and what we make it mean. Because most people have learned how to react, very few people have learned how to stay. Welcome back to The Void and the Flame. I'm Rachel, or Ray. And in the last episode, we talked about the moment that we override ourselves, the moment where something in us notices, feels, hesitates, and then gets talked out of it. The explanation arrives, the justification arrives, the minimization arrives. And before we even realize that it's happening, we're moving away from ourselves. Today's episode begins where the last one left off. Because once you start recognizing those moments, a new question appears. What happens if I don't immediately leave? What happens if I stay? And when I say stay, I don't mean forcing yourself to sit cross-legged on a meditation cushion while pretending to be calm. I don't mean becoming perfectly regulated. And I don't mean suppressing your reactions. I mean staying present long enough to actually hear what the reaction might be trying to tell you. Because most of us are incredibly quick to move. A feeling shows up and we reach for something, an explanation, distraction, conversation, reassurance, certainty, a solution. Have you ever noticed how difficult it is to simply not know? Your boss says, "Can we talk tomorrow?" That's it. No context, no explanation, just four words. And suddenly you're reviewing every interaction you've had for the past month. You're remembering mistakes, replaying conversations, preparing defenses, creating possibilities. Not because anything has happened, but because uncertainty has appeared. And uncertainty creates urgency. Your nervous system wants resolution. It wants clarity. It wants to know where it stands. So the mind gets to work immediately. Not necessarily trying to find the truth, trying to find just some certainty. And those are not always the same thing. The first story your mind gives you is not always wrong, but it is often really fast. It's often protective. It's often attempting to minimize discomfort before it even attempts to understand it. And sometimes that story becomes so loud that we never hear what the feeling underneath it was actually trying to say. Which brings me to something that I've been learning myself. The feeling is rarely the thing that we need to fear. The feeling is usually the doorway. I think one of the problems is that most of us spend years trying to run through the doorway, around the doorway, or pretend like the doorway isn't there, instead of just stopping long enough to see maybe where the door leads. The difficult thing about stories is that most of them don't feel like stories when they're happening. They feel like truth. That's what makes them so convincing. Let's say your friend cancels plans, and immediately something in you reacts. Maybe they don't care. Maybe I'm just not important. Maybe they just didn't want to spend time with me. Now, slow that moment down. Not to judge it, not to make it wrong, just to take a look at it. What actually happened? A friend canceled plans. That's what happened. Everything after that was interpretation. And before anyone misunderstands me, I'm not saying your reaction isn't real. It is. Your disappointment is real. Your hurt is real. Your frustration is real. But the story that your mind creates about why it happened deserves some curiosity. Because sometimes the story is accurate and sometimes it isn't. The problem is that most of us never pause long enough to find out. We feel, then we conclude. We feel, then we assume. We feel, and then we decide what it means. And the speed at which that happens is pretty remarkable. Someone disagrees with you, and suddenly you're defending yourself, trying to explain, trying to clarify, trying to prove your point. Notice that. What feels threatened right now? Is it your opinion, or is it something deeper? Sometimes when we stay with the feeling long enough, we discover we aren't actually protecting the opinion at all. We're protecting an identity, the identity of being competent, of being good, of being understood, maybe the identity of being right. And that changes the conversation completely, because now we're no longer arguing about the topic. We're discovering what feels at risk underneath it. And this is why learning to stay is so powerful, in my opinion. Because if you leave too quickly, you only hear the story. But if you stay, something deeper starts speaking. I think one of the most important questions that I've ever learned to ask myself, not what's wrong with me, which I've asked plenty, not why am I like this, that's probably a second in my real life, and not how do I make this feeling stop, though I have wished that plenty of times. But what is this reaction trying to protect? Think about the text message example. The response doesn't come. An hour passes, then 2. Your mind starts moving. Maybe they're upset. Maybe they're pulling away. Maybe they're losing interest. Whatever it is that your mind would tell yourself in a moment like that. Now I want you to stay in that moment. What is the reaction trying to protect? For one person, it might be a fear of abandonment. For another, it might be a fear of rejection. For someone else, it might be a belief that they've carried for years that says people always leave. Do you see how different that is? The text message was never the whole story. The text message touched something older, something familiar, something already waiting. And this is where I think many people may get stuck because they spend all of their energy trying to solve the trigger when the trigger is often pointing towards the thing that actually needs attention. Go back to the boss example. Your boss says, "Can we talk tomorrow?" And suddenly you're terrified. Maybe the fear isn't really about your boss. Maybe the fear is tied to a belief that your worth depends on getting everything right. Maybe mistakes never felt safe. Maybe criticism never felt safe. Maybe disappointing people never felt safe. Now we're somewhere important. Now we're not managing the reaction, we're understanding it. And understanding creates options because you can't change a pattern you do not recognize. But once you can see it, you stop fighting shadows. You start working with something real. And maybe you're listening to this right now, and part of you is already thinking, what if my story is right? Stay. That's not a bad question. But notice what just happened. Notice the urgency. Notice the need to know, the need to resolve uncertainty immediately, the need to figure it out before we've even finished the conversation. That impulse right there, that's the work. Not because it's wrong, because it's familiar. And learning to stay often begins by noticing how quickly we try to leave. I think one of the most surprising things about this work is realizing how much information actually lives underneath our first reaction. Because most people assume the first thing they feel is the thing that they need to solve. The anxiety, the anger, the jealousy, the fear, the defensiveness, the sadness. But sometimes those feelings are not the deepest truth. They're the doorway. And if you stay long enough, something underneath them begins to emerge. Let's revisit your friend canceling plans again for a moment. And maybe at first you're annoyed, then hurt, then maybe a little angry. But if you stay with it long enough, you begin realizing, I'm not actually upset about tonight. I'm carrying years of feeling like everyone else's needs matter more than mine. The canceled plans touched something. It didn't create it. It revealed it. Or maybe someone's giving you feedback. Not cruel feedback, not an attack, just feedback. And immediately you feel yourself tightening, defending, explaining, preparing your case. Stay. What's happening? Maybe the feedback isn't the real threat. Maybe what's being touched is a part of you that learned a long time ago, if I make mistakes, I'm not safe. If I disappoint people, I'm not worthy. If I get it wrong, then something bad happens. Do you see the difference? Now we're no longer talking about feedback. We're talking about a wound. We're talking about a belief. We're talking about something that has been quietly shaping experiences for far longer than this moment. And honestly, I think this is where a lot of compassion begins. Now, not the kind that excuses everything and not the kind that removes accountability. The kind that helps you understand yourself more clearly. Because when you begin seeing what your reactions are protecting, you stop asking, what's wrong with me? And you start asking, what happened to me? What did I learn? What am I still carrying? What part of me is asking to be seen? And I want to say something here. sometimes when you stay, you don't find an answer. Sometimes you find grief. Sometimes you find exhaustion. Sometimes you find loneliness. Sometimes you find a truth that you've been working very hard not to know. And if that happens, please understand something. That's not a failure. That's awareness. Because you can't begin relating differently to something you refuse to see. And seeing it may hurt. Seeing it is also where freedom begins. And sometimes the answer is surprisingly simple. Could be I'm tired, I'm lonely, I'm grieving, I'm overwhelmed, I'm scared. I don't trust myself yet. I've spent so long adapting that I don't fully know what I want anymore. And I think that's why learning to stay matters so much. Because if we rush away immediately, we never hear any of that. We stay at the surface. We keep solving the trigger, managing the symptoms, chasing the reaction, while the deeper truth keeps waiting patiently underneath, trying to get our attention again and again and again. Not to punish us, not to overwhelm us, and not to prove that we're broken, but because some parts of us have been waiting a very long time to finally be heard. I think there is a piece of this where people sometimes get confused, because once they begin paying attention to themselves, they start noticing more feelings, more reactions, more discomfort, more patterns, more internal movement overall. And that awareness is important, but awareness creates a new responsibility, because feelings are signals. They are not always conclusions. And the distinction can really change your life. Let's go back to the friend who canceled plans one more time. Your disappointment's real. Your hurt's real. Your reaction is real. Those things deserve attention. But the story that says they don't care about me, that deserves investigation. Not immediate belief, investigation. Because sometimes a feeling is pointing towards something true, and sometimes it's pointing towards something familiar. Those are not always the same thing. Think about that for a moment. Sometimes what hurts us most isn't what's happening right now. It's what the moment reminds us of. The feeling is still real. The activation is still real. The reaction is still real. And if we rush straight from feeling to certainty, we often miss the opportunity to understand what we're actually experiencing. I think a lot of people will either dismiss their feelings completely or believe every story that their feelings generate, and neither creates clarity. Imagine someone disagreeing with you. You feel defensive. That feeling matters, but the conclusion, they think I'm stupid, may or may not be true. The feeling is information. The conclusion is a hypothesis. Do you hear that difference? The feeling deserves compassion. The story deserves curiosity. And curiosity is often where wisdom enters. Because curiosity asks, what else could be true? What evidence do I have? What assumptions am I making? What feels familiar about this? What is this reaction trying to protect? And sometimes those questions reveal something surprising. Not that the other person is wrong and not that you're wrong, but that reality is more complex than the first story suggests. And someone can care about you and still disappoint you. Someone can love you and still be limited. Someone can mean well and still hurt you. You can understand someone's pain and still need distance. You can feel afraid and still be safe. You can feel rejected without actually being rejected. And you can feel certain without actually knowing. That's why staying matters. Because staying gives reality time to become more complete. Not simpler, more complete. And honestly, I think that's one of the greatest gifts that we can give ourselves. Not immediate certainty, a more honest relationship with truth. I think when you start forming that honest relationship with truth, there's something really beautiful that starts happening. Because most people think that self-trust is built by always knowing the right answer, being certain, being confident, being sure, never doubting yourself again. But honestly, I don't think that's what self-trust is. I think self-trust is built through relationship, the relationship that you have with yourself. And relationships are not built because someone is perfect. They're built because someone is present, because someone listens, they show up, they stay. And for a lot of people, the relationship with themselves becomes strained for reasons that made perfect sense. Maybe you learn to ignore your feelings. Maybe you learn to prioritize everyone else's needs first. Maybe you learn that keeping the peace was safer than telling the truth. Maybe survival required adaptation. And over time, you stop listening consistently. Not because you didn't have wisdom, because you didn't always have permission. So when people say, I don't trust myself, what they're often describing isn't a lack of intuition. They're describing years of overridden signals, years of talking themselves out of what they felt, years of minimizing, explaining, adapting, performing, enduring. And eventually the relationship becomes harder to hear. Not because the voice disappears, but because it stopped being honored. But every time you stay now, something begins to change. Every time you pause before rushing to certainty, every time you ask, what am I actually feeling? Every time you investigate the story instead of immediately believing it. Every time you stay present long enough to hear what lives underneath the reaction, you send yourself a very different message. You teach your body, my experience matters. My signals are worth listening to. I don't have to abandon myself automatically. I can stay with myself even when things feel uncomfortable. And the beautiful thing is, self-trust rarely returns dramatically. Most of the time, it returns quietly, the way dawn kind of arrives, slowly, and then all at once. You start recognizing yourself faster. You notice when you're people-pleasing. You notice when you're performing okayness. You notice when you're explaining away discomfort. You notice when you're reacting from fear. You notice when your body means no while your mouth is saying yes. And instead of overriding those moments immediately, you stay. You listen. You become curious. And little by little, life starts feeling different. Not because every problem disappears, but because you're no longer fighting yourself inside every experience. You're no longer arguing with every signal, negotiating with every feeling, convincing yourself away from every truth. And honestly, I think that's one of the deepest forms of healing there is. Not becoming someone entirely different, becoming someone who can finally remain connected to themselves while living, while loving, while grieving, while succeeding, while struggling, while being fully human. And from that place, something else begins to return to choice. Because once you're no longer trapped inside every reaction, you gain access to something powerful, the ability to choose your response. Not perfectly, not every time, but more often than before. And those moments matter because those moments slowly become a life. Maybe that's the thing that I hope you take with you this episode. Not that every feeling is true, not that every reaction is accurate, not that every uncomfortable moment contains some profound revelation, but that your experience is worth listening to because so many of us have spent years trying to get away from ourselves, trying to get away from discomfort, trying to get away from uncertainty, trying to get away from fear, grief, anger, loneliness. And in the process, we sometimes get away from parts of ourselves too. The parts that needed attention, needed compassion, needed truth, rest, boundaries. The parts that needed permission. The parts that have been speaking for years through anxiety, exhaustion, resentment, overthinking, through reactions we don't fully understand. Not because they were trying to ruin our lives, because they were trying to get our attention. And maybe that's what learning to stay really is. Not becoming fearless, not becoming perfectly regulated, not never getting triggered again. I wish. Maybe it's becoming willing to sit beside yourself long enough to hear what's been waiting to be heard. To ask, what am I actually feeling? What story am I telling? What is this reaction trying to protect? And what becomes possible if I stop running long enough to listen? Because underneath many reactions isn't a problem to solve. It's a message, a fear, a belief, a grief, truth, a need, a younger part of you that learned something a long time ago and has been carrying it ever since. And when you stay, really stay, something remarkable begins to happen. You stop treating yourself like an enemy. You stop treating every feeling like an emergency. You stop needing immediate certainty. Because the goal was never to become someone who doesn't feel. The goal was never to eliminate fear or uncertainty or discomfort. The goal was never to become perfectly healed. The goal was to stop facing those experiences alone, to become someone who can remain with themselves through them, and someone who doesn't immediately disappear the moment life becomes uncomfortable. And slowly, you begin building a relationship with yourself that can hold complexity, a relationship that can hold uncertainty, a relationship that can hold discomfort, a relationship that can hold truth. And once that begins, something else starts to become visible. The patterns, the repetition, the things you explained away, the things you normalized, the things that you've been trying not to see. And that's where we're going next. Because once you learn how to stay, you begin seeing what's been there all along. Not to judge it, not to fear it, and not to make yourself wrong, simply to see it clearly. But for now, just notice. Notice the moment when discomfort appears. Notice the stories that arrive. Notice what they're trying to protect. And if you can, stay. Just a little longer than you normally would. You don't have to stay forever, just long enough to hear what's been trying to speak. Because the thing that you've been searching for may already be trying to find you. They've just been waiting for you to stop running long enough to listen. Until next time, always remember, you don't have to keep the fire lit alone.